Hi, I'm Charlie,
I'm Joe.
And I'm Jack.
and we are the sons of Tommy Greenwald, who wrote Charlie Joe Jackson's Guide to Not Reading. We're going to read 20 pages a day of it for you and put it up online, starting right now. Chapter 1. My name is Charlie Joe Jackson, and I hate reading. And if you're reading this book, you hate reading too. In fact, you do whatever you can to avoid reading. And the fact that you're holding a book in your hand right now is kind of shocking. I know exactly how you feel. I'm one of you. Just remember, you are not alone. We'll get through this together.
Chapter 2. This book is a guide for people like us. It will serve two purposes. One, it will show people how to get out of reading. And two, on those unfortunate occasions when you're not able to get out of reading and forced to read a book, it will be a nice, easy book to read. In all likelihood, you're reading this book against your will, and I sympathize with you. Therefore, I also will make this solemn promise. These chapters will be short, the pages will be even shorter, and whenever possible, I will keep the words shortest, one syllable or less. I'm also going to include some specific tips about reading or not reading throughout this book. Some have to do with getting out of reading altogether, which is a strategy that I recommend, and some have to do with making the best of it. If you do have to read a book, it can be surprisingly hard to avoid reading a book at some point in your life, even in middle school as it turns out. You'll understand more as our story unfolds. One of my book reading friends, Jake Katz, used that term once when he was reading what he described as a paper he was writing. He became somewhat less of a friend right at that very moment.
Charlie Joe's tip number 1. If you have to read a book, make sure it has short chapters. This first tip is pretty self-explanatory. Think about it. If your mom or dad tells you to read 3 chapters before bed, wouldn't you rather the chapters be 1 page each instead of 10 pages each? Wouldn't you rather read 3 pages instead of 30 pages? That way, you're reading 27 less pages. But you can still say, hey, guess what? I read my 3 chapters. Trust me, they'll never know the difference.
Chapter 3. I've hated reading as far back as I can remember. I didn't mind it when my mom read to me when I was little, and that was fine because I could stay up later. And sometimes she even fell asleep in my bed, which I have to admit I actually liked at the time. But then as I got a little older, she started to say, okay, now you read the rest of the chapter. And that was just so not going to happen. So I'd cry and she'd read some more. By the way, I learned to cry on purpose that way. It's a useful skill. I've noticed that girls really like it when a guy gets teary sometimes, like at a movie where the hero makes a supreme sacrifice for his one true love, for example, because that means he's sensitive or something, and girls seem to like that. Personally, I prefer action movies where somebody blows something up, or a comedy where some chubby guy falls in love with a gorgeous lifeguard who only speaks French. That's more my speed. Anyway, the whole crying in front of mom so I wouldn't have to read myself thing, that worked out great. Until I was about 10.
Chapter 4. So here I am in middle school, and I'm proud to say that I still hate reading, which is how the whole mess began. It started when I was supposed to read this book, Billy's Bargain, for my English class. It's about this kid, Billy, and the bargain he strikes with the devil to pitch a no-hitter in the championship game. But it turns out the devil is actually just a guy that was hired by Billy's dad to pretend to be the devil, because Billy's dad figures that if Billy thinks he made a deal with the devil to pitch a no-hitter, then Billy would have the confidence to actually pitch a no-hitter. It's not as complicated as I just made it sound. It's apparently a pretty good book, according to my teacher, Miss Farrell. And I guess it's got one of those just believe in yourself and others will believe in you too messages that grown-up kids want kids to hear over and over. Anyways, like I said, that's where I ran into trouble. I did what I usually do. I read the back cover, the front inside flap, the first chapter, and the last chapter.
Then I sat next to my friend, Timmy McGivney, at lunch. For about 2 years, Timmy and I had what you might call an arrangement. I would buy him an ice cream sandwich, and he would tell me all about what was in the rest of the book. It was a win-win situation, which is one of those weird expressions my parents use all the time. Naturally, I figured we'd make the same deal we always made. So, Timmy, I said, handing him his ice cream sandwich. Billy's Bargain was a pretty good book. How would you know? He asked. He always asked me that. It was kind of a routine we had. Well, the beginning and ending were very good. I guess so, Timmy said. He was fiddling with his lacrosse stick. Lacrosse was the only thing he loved more than ice cream sandwiches. Tryouts coming up, huh? I said, pointing at his stick. Yup, he said. I waited for him to say something else, but he didn't. That was weird. Usually he could talk about lacrosse for hours. Timmy wolfed down his ice cream sandwich and looked at mine. I'm actually really hungry today, he said. Really, really hungry. I suddenly got a pretty uneasy feeling. What do you mean, really, really hungry? I'm saying I'm so hungry I could eat 2 ice cream sandwiches, Timmy said. Maybe 3. I looked at him in disbelief. We'd had the same deal going for almost a year. I'd handed over enough free ice cream for him to start his own dairy farm. Now all of a sudden he was pulling this? I looked around. I checked my pocket for money. I considered my options. Then I did the only thing I could do. I bought him another ice cream sandwich.
After lunch, I went to the library and looked up the word blackmail, just to make sure I understood exactly what was happening. The librarian, Mrs. Reedy, was an old friend of mine, even though she represented everything evil. Back in the old days, she was the librarian at my elementary school, and she used to try anything to get me to read. One time in first grade, she sat me down and had me listen to a song called Grab a Book and Go, all about the joys of reading. One of the verses went, "Snuggle in your bed, the day is near its end. All alone, but you're not alone, a book can be a friend." I've never quite forgiven her. So needless to say, she gave me quite the double take when I walked in. "Charlie Joe," she said. "Did she take a wrong turn somewhere?" I laughed. Always good to laugh at an adult's jokes, regardless of whether or not they're funny. "I just need to look something up," I answered, trying to keep the conversation into a minimum so I could take care of business and get out of there. Miss Reedy looked at me and winked. "Well, don't worry, Charlie Joe. Your secret is safe with me," she said.
Chapter 5. I just looked at the previous chapter and realized it was way too long. I just ignored Charlie Joe's tip number 1. Sorry about that. Won't happen again.
Charlie Joe's tip number 2. Never read a book by someone whose name you can't pronounce. Let's face it, chances are you wouldn't be reading this book if it were called Venedikt Styorkovsky's Guide to Not Reading. I can't even pronounce it. And I sure wouldn't be writing it. My point is, if you have to read, it's really important to make sure the cover doesn't scare you in any way. And that starts with the author's name. It has to be reader friendly, like Charlie Joe Jackson, for example.
Chapter 6. When I got home from school that day, I was still annoyed about Timmy's power move. 2 ice cream sandwiches? What's next? A Carvel Fudgy the Whale cake? I threw down my ridiculously heavy backpack. There should be a law against ridiculously heavy backpacks, by the way. And I made myself a bowl of cereal. Then I considered my options. Number 1, doing homework, which involved reading. Or number 2, playing with the dogs. Not a hard choice. We have 2 dogs, Moose and Coco. They're both lab mixes, and we rescued them from the pound. They have a great life. They eat, sleep, play, and absolutely no reading of any kind. I'm sure it won't surprise you to learn that occasionally I get jealous of both of them. After I threw the tennis ball approximately 4,386 times, I managed to forget all about Timmy McGibney and his ice cream sandwiches. Temporarily.
Charlie Joe's tip number 3. There are always ways to get out of reading. Here's a short list. Sleep. Clean your room. Pretend to clean your room. Go outside. Parents love it when you go outside. Practice an instrument, even if you don't play one. Parents love it when you're practicing music without having to be nagged about it. Eat. That's my personal favorite. Feed your book to the dog. Clean up the dog's throw up. Run away from home, only in extreme cases, and plead insanity.
Chapter 7. So are you going to tell me what was in the middle of the book, or aren't you? It was the next day, and I was following Timmy and his lacrosse stick around the cafeteria. He still was not telling me what happened in the middle of Billy's bargain, and I was starting to panic. I'd bought him 2 ice cream sandwiches, a slice of pizza, and 3 chocolate milks, but nothing. I suddenly realized that this wasn't about free food. Something else was bothering Timmy, and I needed to find out what it was. My non-reading future depended on it. The first thing to do was to find Katie Friedman, who'd been my best friend from kindergarten to 4th grade, which was when I suddenly realized you weren't allowed to have a girl best friend. But even though we technically still weren't best friends anymore, I still told her everything, and in times of crisis, she was my go-to problem solver. I've found that in matters of feelings and thinking, girls seem to have a handle on things that guys just don't. They seem to care more, or maybe they're just less afraid to admit it. And Katie Friedman cares more than everyone else. She gets what you're telling her and probably understands what you're talking about more than you do. I guess you could say she reads between the lines, which is an expression that's meant as a compliment even though it has the word reads in it. But I don't mean to suggest that I'm in love with her or anything. I'm not. Like I said, we're just best friends, or would be if that sort of thing was allowed. At any rate, I found her in her usual spot, back left corner of the cafeteria by the vending machines, texting the girls right next to her. You aren't allowed to text in school, but at recess and lunch, everybody snuck in a few. I quietly called her over. She put away her phone and followed me around the corner. What's up? Katie was the only one who knew about that deal that Timmy and I had. She was a big reader and constantly told me what a loser I was for hating books. But she gave me points for creativity. I quickly filled her in on what was going on, and now for some reason, all the ice cream sandwiches in the world weren't going to make Timmy tell me what was in the middle of that freaking book. She looked at me, then she laughed. I was shocked. What? What? She shook her head. You are so clueless. Why are boys so clueless? Why do they never notice the real things that are going on in the world? It's bad enough that you refuse to read, Charlie Joe, but would it kill you to go to a movie every once in a while where something actually meaningful happens instead of some chubby guy falling in love with a gorgeous lifeguard who only speaks French? She knew me pretty well. You might actually learn something about psychology. Katie had recently decided she wanted to be a therapist when she got older, like her parents. I wanted so badly to come up with something smart and psychologically impressive to say in return, but all I could come up with was, chubby guys falling for gorgeous lifeguards who only speak French are funny. Katie smiled. One of the things I loved about her was that whenever she yelled at me, she always felt really guilty right afterward. And this time, she felt guilty enough to give me the piece of information I'd come looking for. The problem isn't Timmy, it's Eliza.
Charlie Joe's tip number 4. If you want girls to like you, don't read. Girls think it's kind of cool if you don't read a lot and still get good grades. It's kind of like if you're smart, but you don't even try. As opposed to the kids who work really hard and get good grades, or the kids who don't work at all and get bad grades. Girls don't really like either of those kinds of boys. So if you want to get girls, it's important to read as little as possible and still do well in school. Here's how. Number 1, participate in class. Ask a lot of questions. Seem really enthusiastic. Number 2, turn in all your homework on time. Number 3, make sure that a friend of yours is assigned the same book and make sure he's actually reading it. Number 4, bring pictures of your dogs to school and show them to your teachers. Make sure the pictures show the dogs doing cute things, the kind of things that get on YouTube. Number 5, don't get in trouble at lunch. Number 6, don't get in trouble at recess. Number 7, if the book you're supposed to read was turned into a movie, rent the movie. Number 8, if the book you're supposed to read was turned into an audiobook, listen to the audiobook. It counts as reading, but it's not. Number 9, make sure you get great grades in the classes that don't involve reading, like gym. Number 10, partner with someone who is really smart in science. Number 11, read the first and last chapters of every book. And number 12, extra credit. Always do the extra credit. as long as it doesn't involve reading. That's 20 pages to be continued.